The emotional experience of coming back is huge. I think so often in businesses, we sort of think there's no space for emotions.
Hi and welcome to Thrivalism. I'm Toby Brown and today I'm in conversation with Ruth Moody. Ruth is an executive coach with a wealth of experience helping mothers and businesses improve their return to work experience. It's a conversation that hits close to home for many, the challenges and triumphs of mothers returning to the workforce. We take a deep dive into the dynamics, attitudes and practical strategies surrounding this pivotal and often fraught life transition. We touch on generational attitudes, the impact of technology and the emotional aspects of returning to work. So whether you're a returning professional, a manager navigating team dynamics, or someone just curious about creating a more inclusive workplace culture, this episode is for you. We had a slight issue with the audio quality, but probably not enough to distract from some great content. Here we go. So, Ruth, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.
I thought it would be really interesting to get you on when I saw a LinkedIn post of yours, which was basically talking about Jurassic organisations and ancient attitudes to mothers returning to work. And I thought there's so much to talk about there. And it's a subject that comes up quite a lot with people I'm talking to, and also in my own personal life anyway. And it's something you've got a lot of experience with and you're really interested in. So what was it that led you to write? Because the post felt quite angry to me at the way some organisations treat their staff and they return to work after having children. What was it that led up to you posting that?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think I hear lots of stories with the women I'm working with around attitudes to them when they come back to work. And I guess some of those attitudes are perhaps perceived and not real. But for lots of people, they come back to work with a real desire to be there and wanting to kind of re-enter that world of no children hanging off you and, you know, actually I can use my brain.
Yeah,
and they find that there's just this kind of undercurrent of, oh, she's part-time, oh, she won't be the same since she's had a baby. And even though legally organisations are much better at kind of making provision for women coming back to work, that doesn't take into consideration some of those attitudes that exist perhaps with some of the older members of staff who think that once you've had a baby, you aren't the same, you're not full-time. And I think women sometimes take that on as truth and they start to doubt themselves as well. And then that impacts their confidence. And so it becomes this kind of vicious circle.
You mentioned a generational thing there. Is that how you view it? Do you think that is just the older generation, that attitude, or do you see that seep downwards further into the youngers?
I think if I'm going to generalise,
Bit late.
which I am, I think that there are certain industries that you see it more in. And I think certainly that becomes a generational thing where you've got people who've worked for a long time whose attitude is if you're not there all of the time, if you're not doing long hours, if you're not, you know, available to the organisation whenever they want you, then you can't be doing a good enough job. And I don't think that is just focused on women coming back to work. I think it also exists around the sort of flexible working piece, people working from home.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not here, if you're not present, because there's an expectation that at all hours you can work and be available. And I think there's some really interesting research around how much extra time women put in. I think they were like 1.5 more times likely to do an extra 3 hours at home, both in terms of like childcare, household tasks. And then if you add on to that extra work as well, then that's a phenomenal amount that women are trying to do.
3 hours at home per
day.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot.
And so I think technology hasn't helped that because it's almost like there's no separation now between work and home. Of course, there are loads of benefits of technology and being able to work from home being one of them, but the fact that you then almost can't switch off. And so many of the women I work with feel as though they have to switch back on after the kids are in bed to try and catch up on emails. But that, I think, is driven by the fact that as an organisation, where they work are not allowing that flexibility in terms of like reduction of work. It's almost as though they're expected to try and do even more, but sort of squeezed into weird hours.
To make up for being cheeky enough to disappear from time.
Yeah.
And I guess that takes us down two roads there. There's the personal experience of people you've worked with, which I like to sort of delve into some of the stuff that you've heard from them. And then the organisational experience of how do organisations, A, look out for it and B, combat it if that's an attitude that's happening within them. So can we dive into some of the women you work with and some of the things you've heard from them and the sort of common challenges you hear?
Yeah. So I think universally, women coming back to work often really struggle with confidence because they've been through this enormous change and they've been out of the workplace for often a year. sometimes a bit less, and they start to doubt themselves in terms of, can I still do this job? Also, I think once you've switched your brain off from working, you can feel as though there's a whole baby brain thing.
Yeah.
And interestingly, again, there is some research around how the brain changes and the sort of bits of grey matter reduce or something. But actually then after 2 years, it's all back again, and your brain is specialised and has enabled you to become even more focused. So it's a myth, but I think women come back to work believing that they aren't necessarily as good as they were. And I think then the challenge is around, how do I juggle? Because suddenly they've got to leave at a certain time. They can't just think, I'm going to do an extra hour, I'll be fine, I'll get that done. No, I've got to leave because I've got to pick up my child from childcare.
Yeah.
You know, there's all of the stuff around part-time working. How will people view me? What if they start to bypass me because I'm not here on a Friday, and they go to somebody else to make the decision, and they sort of get stuck in that kind of cyclical thinking of, how can I prove myself because I'm not here? So there's just sort of so much. And I think a lot of it's to an emotional level for women coming back to work, in terms of how they worry about themselves and how they worry that they're going to be perceived.
Yeah, that reminded me of, I saw a speech from a showrunner. I can't remember her name, but I'll put it in the show notes when I've dug it up and done my research again. But she accepted an award and did sort of a speech with it. And she was saying, if you see me succeed in one sphere, it's because I'm failing in another. And I think that touches on a few things. She just said, she's like, if I'm doing really well at my job, I'm doing really badly at home. And if I'm doing really well at home, I'm not at work and stuff is happening when I'm not there to oversee it. And it's impossible to be functional in all directions at the same time, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. And actually, I would add to that for a lot of women, I think they probably feel that they're failing in all areas because they're not quite being their best at work, and they're not quite being their best at home either. And so they just end up feeling a bit rubbish about it all.
Even if it's a solid 6 out of 10 in all areas, that still feels pretty bad, doesn't it? Yeah. And what is your advice to people you coach when they come to you with these sort of problems?
So there's an interesting one about coaching. So as a coach, my job isn't to give advice.
Just listen.
Yeah, it's to ask good questions, to reflect back what I'm hearing, to help them work out what's right for them. I guess why people want to work with me in terms of the return to work coaching is that they know I've had those experiences, and they perhaps look to me for reassurance around, am I going mad? Is this the right thing to be thinking? And I can sort of offer some of my experiences. But generally they get to work that out for themselves in terms of what picture for them feels right, and how can they make that happen for themselves.
And what are some of the stages they might go through on that process to find out what's right for them? Where might they start usually?
So we often look at what their non-negotiables are. So, okay, so you're coming back to work. How often are you willing to miss bedtime, for example?
Right, so really granular, solid. Yeah.
Particularly if they're looking at the work-life balance side of things, because I think that's often one of the big challenges for women is, how do I now do both and do both well enough?
Yeah.
And so things like, how many days am I willing to travel with work, and those kind of things can come into that picture. There's also then, how am I managing my diary? Because I think for a lot of people, particularly coming back to work since COVID, Teams meetings just get put in. And I don't think this is a return to work issue necessarily. It exists across lots of organisations. Yeah, but I mean, the sort of etiquette around meetings. But I think for women, or for a lot of people, they don't feel able to take control of that, and they just sort of end up bouncing from one meeting to the next, feeling wildly out of control, then trying to catch up on emails and their actual work in the evenings. And so helping them to sort of start looking at how they can protect time in their diary to do planning, to do big projects, to do thinking, actually, because we all need thinking time. And just working with them around that can be a really useful space as well.
And I guess it must be difficult for some people returning to work who are like, okay, I need to protect my time. I'm not going to be in meetings that are relevant to me. And that's fine. But then you go into work for a massive corporation and they're like, no, you have to be here, you have to do this, and here's 25 things you need to do. How do people advocate for themselves in that situation, especially when they might be feeling quite vulnerable because they are just coming back to work anyway?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think when people first come back, then I just want them to focus on the first 30 days.
Right.
So what we're going to do in this first month is going to help you to feel as though you're stepping back in a way that you're in control, you're feeling confident, and you're not at the mercy of the system. And so a lot of that will be around, who do you need to reform relationships with? How can you get those booked in? And sort of starting to get them to plan it so that they don't just arrive and feel just kind of overwhelmed with this enormous mountain of stuff.
Yeah, and how far in advance would you ideally start talking about that stuff?
Well, I think organisations that do it well do it before women go on maternity leave.
Right.
So
okay.
they
do you see that often?
No. Those rare organisations where they start before they're going to actually help them look at the transition out of work as well. But before they go, get them thinking about, so what are the bits of my job that I really enjoy, that I'm good at, that I want to protect, so that when they come back, perhaps having lost that bit of confidence, they can check back in with, well, these were the things that I really loved and enjoyed and was good at, and the areas I thrived in. And so it helps to remind them that they can pick those back up again.
What format might that live in? So say you're just about to go on maternity leave and you have that conversation. That almost feels like a scrapbook from the past that you then pick up a year or so later and be like, oh, these things. What might be a good, like, is that a notebook entry? Is that an email to yourself? What's some nice ways?
Yeah, I mean, either of those would be good ideas. I think it's not a one-off conversation. So I would hope that an organisation might start to have those conversations regularly in the build-up to someone going away, and that they're capturing them in a notebook or on an email or just a shared document, so that when they come back, they've got that as a sort of working document to refer back to. But also talking to them about how you're feeling about going off on maternity leave, because this in itself is a big change, particularly for women who are going off to have their first child. I think everyone says, oh, you'll never know what it's going to be like until you've done it, and you won't. But actually giving some thought to, this is an enormous life change I'm about to go through, and suddenly I'm not going to be at work. And for a lot of people, that's their identity for a long time, and they're not there anymore.
I guess the other thing is, like, when we get new starters, we try to onboard them quite comprehensively, so they get a real understanding of strategy and culture and all those sort of things. And then when you come back to work, you don't get re-onboarded, do you? And what's changed over the time you've been away, you just sort of get expected to pick up where you left off. Is there any, have you seen anyone who does almost re-submerging into the world of work?
Yeah, I think that is just exactly the way to do it, is to treat somebody as though they're starting again afresh, rather than, oh, great, you're back. Here's all of the stuff that didn't get done whilst you were away. And by the way, your desk's moved, and can you get on with it? Oh, and you haven't got a computer for the next 2 weeks. And, I've heard so many stories of people who just arrived back and they're told that, oh, well, there isn't space for you to sit with your team, so we're going to stick you over there on a hot desk where you are completely isolated, and just chuck a load of work at you and hope that it's going to be okay. And inevitably people end up feeling really isolated or wanting to leave. Whereas I think actually, if you can treat this as coming into the organisation afresh, so much would have changed in a year.
Yeah.
New people have arrived, people have gone, new systems might have been created, new software, just so much stuff. And actually, if you can take the time to really help people immerse themselves in that, then it can help them just to feel a bit more like they've landed.
But what's your view on keeping in touch days and stuff like that? Because I've heard some people say they feel a bit intrusive and actually they don't want to think about work for a year and come back, which I totally understand. And some people say they've been incredibly useful and actually make them still feel a bit bonded with the team. Do you hear much either way on that?
No, I probably don't actually. I think if it's possible to allow flexibility around what would work for that person would be the best. I mean, I guess there's merit in staying in touch, isn't there, so that you don't just feel completely detached and then suddenly have to come back again. But I don't think it should be forced.
Yeah. What are some mistakes you see companies do that might be well-intentioned but have the wrong effect or don't work as they're intended? Is there anything you see repeated from companies that probably should know better?
I think it's just that assumption that people are going to be okay. And that relief that, oh, thank goodness they're back, and all of these projects that have been on hold, that the person who's perhaps been covering that role hasn't been able to do, and just chucked back in their direction. And also I think companies who start off on the right foot and sort of make all the right noises, and then quite quickly just treat them as though, right, you're back now, get on with it.
You've had a week.
Yeah.
Go on, catch up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And are there any companies who do it really well? Like you mentioned a couple of people earlier without sort of naming any names. Have you seen anyone who you think everyone should steal these processes or everybody should do it like this?
I think I've probably seen good practice across lots of different organisations. I don't know that I've seen any one organisation do it really well. I think that kind of pre-going on maternity leave bit is crucial. I think then the starting the conversations before people come back, even if it's not in a sort of formal keeping in touch day, is brilliant as well, because it just helps people to start to talk about how they're feeling about coming back. And I think that's crucial. People are often spend time talking about the practicalities of coming back in terms of, well, this is what your job's going to look like and here are the tasks you need to pick up and those sorts of things. But actually the emotional experience of coming back is huge. I think so often in businesses, we sort of think, oh, well, emotions, there's no space for emotions. We're all experiencing them all the time. And actually, if you can be more aware of what's going on for you, what's going on in your brain that's making you, freeze, not be able to think properly or feel excited, that can really help people just get into that right headspace for coming back to work.
That's always quite a tricky conversation to have, though, isn't it? Because who does that conversation then sit with?
Depends on the relationship you've got with them. I think some people have conversations around emotions very easily and effectively, and other people do it in a way that just sort of feels a bit painful and well, none of us want to be having this conversation.
You're feeling all right, aren't you? You're fine, aren't you? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I think unless there's a really strong culture where people are vulnerable easily and willing to share their emotions, then it's probably best done by somebody outside. And I guess that's where I come in for a lot of organisations. I can have those conversations very easily.
When organisations bring you in to do that, what often is their brief to you, and where do you start, and how do you start the process of trying to get to the bottom of it?
So I think there are one of two routes for this. One of them is that an organisation says, we just want to create some space for this person returning to work to arrive and to think through whatever's relevant for them so that they can be the best they possibly can be when they come back to work. Yeah. And they almost don't care what we talk about. It's very much driven by the individual who I'm coaching.
Right.
That's brilliant, because that really
feels very progressive.
But it also really allows that person to kind of take control of what's important to them. And that, I think, is where you can do some really powerful work. I think the other route is that organisations say, okay, they're coming back, but here are some specific objectives we'd like you to achieve with this person, which is fine. And a lot of coaching, which isn't return to work coaching, is around that kind of objective setting that an organisation is part of. But that then involves a tri-party meeting where you've got somebody from the organisation saying, this is what we want to achieve, and all of us agreeing it. And it does then sort of slightly constrain the coaching, because we know that we've got to have those in sight at all times.
Those goals, yeah. Can we talk a bit about your back to work experience and why it's of interest to you? So what's your experience of returning to work after children?
Well, it's really interesting because, I've run my own business now for nearly 20 years, and I didn't think that I would struggle with coming back to work, because I was like, well, I'm the boss, and there's nobody here to make this a difficult experience for myself. And the team had been brilliant whilst I was off, but I suddenly found myself thinking, oh, what's my role? How do I fit into this? Because these guys who've been running my business whilst I've been on maternity leave have done a really good job. And so it took me a while to kind of find my feet again, both in terms of being in the business, but also out with clients, because I do a lot of facilitation as well, so leadership development programs. And I found myself, when I was co-facilitating with my business partner, stepping back and feeling as though my voice wasn't as important, and that I'd kind of gone rusty over the 12 months that I was off. And it was a really interesting experience for me to notice that. And I think I was then more prepared for it the second time around. I had the same experience again. And
you knew it was coming.
Yeah. And so actually it's been really good for me to notice that, because I had the best possible chance of coming back and it being a positive thing, because of the fact that it was my own business, and yet I still found it difficult.
And what was your process for coming back from that? Like the first time when you weren't particularly prepared for it, but you obviously found your feet eventually. What was that process like for you?
So I think the first time and the second time are very different. The first time I just kind of had to take a deep breath and get on with it, because I just needed to be present and be in work. And I think almost just doing it built my confidence back up again. I think the second time I was much more deliberate about it, because I'd been really interested in that whole experience of returning to work. I'd done quite a lot of thinking on my second maternity leave about, so what do I want my work life to look like when I go back? And is it more of the same, or does that picture now need to look a bit different? And I decided it did need to look a bit different. And so part of coming back was me then having a supervisor, mentor type person, because I wanted to work towards a particular qualification within coaching. And I was also going to be setting up a more specifically focused website around return to work coaching. Yeah. So almost I had some goals that I wanted to achieve, which helped me to feel as though there was a purpose and a reason for coming back.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if there's somebody listening who is about to return to work, but they might not be able to get a coach for whatever reason, and they've obviously been off work, so they can't go back in time and have those conversations, what would you advise people to start thinking about in terms of their, say, return to work in 2 months' time? What are some things people might be able to put in place to start making that easy for themselves, or easier?
Well, first of all, I think it's never too late to do this. So even if people have gone back already and they're sort of floundering a bit, then they can sort of still take that time to think about what they need. So I think at whatever stage people are at, creating themselves the space to think is the most important thing, because I suppose particularly when you are a mum with young children, it's easy to just kind of battle your way through every day, dealing with one crisis or small meltdown to the next, and never give yourself any time to think. So I think just carving yourself out some time to even go and sit with a coffee in a coffee shop and think, so what's important to me about work? Which are the things that I really want to protect and maintain? What are the things I'm most worried about? Who can I seek support from with those things? Just starting to ask yourself some questions and give yourself that thinking time can be really good to reveal some of the the things that are important to you.
Yeah. Looking ahead, what are some of the trends you see in workplace culture coming down the pipe, and how do you think they're going to impact sort of the work you're doing?
So I think, obviously, we've seen huge change since the pandemic in terms of people moving to more flexible working and working online. And I think one of the challenges for returning women is coming back to work where people aren't face-to-face, because as humans, we've evolved to need connection. And I think particularly when you're feeling vulnerable and stepping back into a situation where perhaps confidence is low, that lack of face-to-face connection can have a huge impact on how people feel. And so if this is now going to be how work is, I guess organisations now need to start thinking about how do they create that connection and how do they get people back into the office as well, because I think even if it's not every day, for people coming back to work, that ability to sit down with people.
Yeah, well, super important as far as we're concerned. Yeah. And I guess some companies might have to push that face-to-face element a bit, because it's quite easy if you're feeling vulnerable, a bit removed, a bit remote, and somebody goes, do you want to do it on Teams or face-to-face? You'll probably go, I'll do it on Teams and just sort of keep it low-key and hide away. But so people might have to push the idea that face-to-face meeting should happen, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's very convenient as well, isn't it, to be at home, particularly if you've got children, because then you can just down tools, go and pick them up and come back and pick up work again. But actually, there's something to be said for having that separation, I think, even if it's not every day. Yeah. Just so that you can come in and be at work and be with people.
Bit of grown-up headspace.
Yes.
We all love a bit of that. Yeah, perfect. I think that's a great note to finish on. Thank you. Where can people find out more about I can't speak. Where can people find out more about what you do?
So I run an organisation called Ruth Moody Coaching. So my website is ruthmoodycoaching.co.uk. So there's lots of information on there about return to work coaching and what that experience is like and who I am.
Awesome. We'll link to it in the show notes.
Lovely.
Ruth, thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Thrivalism. And if you enjoyed it, which I hope you did because you stayed all the way to the end, do give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks and see you soon.